Hello, my name is Gopala Vasudevan, and today we'll talk about capital budgeting. So Chapter 9 introduces you to capital budgeting, and Chapter 10 we evaluate capital budgeting in more detail. So here we will talk about the different methods that are used to evaluate investments, and these are the payback, the discounted payback, the internal rate of return, and the net present value. So these are the four popular ways to evaluate investment. Now, if you look at the textbook, they stress the importance of the net present value. Now, the net present value is definitely important, but in reality, there are a lot of surveys done on the use of capital budgeting by industry, and typically what they find is that the most common method to evaluate investments tends to be the internal rate of return and the net present value. So there is almost an even split between the use of the net present value and the internal rate of return in industry. Now, smaller companies, small business and so on, they tend to use the payback and the discounted payback. Now, the reason why they tend to use the payback and the discounted payback is because these are simple, but this gives you an idea regarding the value of the project. Okay. So before we talk about that, we want to discuss what are some of the most important things you want to look for when you use a capital budgeting decision rule. So the first one is, does the decision rule adjust for the time value of money? So if you look at the payback, it does not incorporate the time value of money. Now, the discounted payback does, the net present value certainly does, and the internal rate of return, it does in a different sort of way. Does the decision rule adjust for risk? So the discounted payback does use that. The net present value does use that. The regular payback does not use that. Does the decision rule provide information on whether we are creating value for the firm? So clearly the net present value does that. So if you look at all these choices, perhaps what you find here is that the only method that incorporates all these things, the time value of money for risk and provide information, that is the net present value. So that's perhaps the reason why the textbook and most academics stress the importance of the net present value. But in reality, the internal rate of return is equally popular, especially in the industry. So here we want to look at an investment, and for this investment you have to invest $165,000 in year 0, and what you get is in year 1 you get $63,120. In year 2, you get $70,800, and year 3, you get $91,080. Now, you can ignore the net income numbers given as well as the average book value. So here, the required return is 12%. So, as far as the payback is concerned, what do we do here? What we do here is we try to we want to look for the cash flows, and then we want to find out how quickly we get back our investment. And what is the decision rule? Except if the payback period is less than some preset limit. So one of the examples is, if you look at real estate, a lot of the time what people do is they want to have a payback of 10 years. So what that means is that, let's say you invest $1 million, you want to see whether you can recover $100,000 every year. So that is one way to look at an investment. Okay. So how do you find out the payback for this investment? In year 1, we are getting $63,120. So we invested $165,000. So what we find here is that we still have to get back $101,880 at the end of the first year. In year 2, you're getting $70,800. So we still need to recover $31,080 by year 2. And in year 3, what you're actually getting is, you're actually getting $91,080. So if you want to do the investment to see how many years it takes, in this case it takes 2 years and a little more time. So the time it takes is the $31,080 divided by the $91,080. That gives you the payback period of the investment. Now, if you want to answer some questions here, does the payback rule account for the time value of money? It does not. Does the payback rule account for the risk of the cash flows? It does not. Does the payback rule provide an indication about the increase in value? It does not. Should we consider the payback rule for our primary decision rule? So mainly because of these reasons, the payback, we should not be using that as the primary decision rule. But why do still people use that? Some of the reasons are, it's easy to understand, it adjusts for the uncertainty of later cash flows, and bias towards liquidity. So what we are saying here is that you always want to take investments where we get paid back quickly and we generate cash very quickly. And what are the disadvantages? Ignores the time value of money, ignores cash flows beyond the cutoff rate. So here what we are saying is that we could be losing a ton of money after the payback period. It doesn't matter to us. We are ignoring that. And biased against long-term projects such as R&D and new projects. So as an example, if you look at a biotechnology investment, it takes a lot of time to make money on a biotechnology investment. So if you are trying to find a cure for cancer or something like that, it's going to take 5-10 years. And if you are using something like a payback, we are automatically giving up on such investments simply because the payback period is very long. Okay. So to overcome that, people talk about the discounted payback period. So what is the discounted payback period? The basic difference between the payback and the discounted payback is that in this case, we are finding out the present value of each cash flow, and then we are trying to see how many years it takes to get back our investment. So what is the decision rule? Accept the project if it pays back on a discounted basis within the specified time. Okay, so that is the decision rule. So let's look at this, the same example. So in year 1, we are getting $165,000, sorry, $63,120. So the present value of that is $63,120 divided by 1.12. So at the end of year 1, we still have to get back $108,643. In year 2, we get $108,643 minus the $70,000 we got back. So here, when you try to find the present value, we want to discount it for 2 years. So that is why 70,800 divided by 1.12 the whole square. So by the end of year 2, we still have to get back 52,202, and in year 3 we are getting 91,080 divided by 1.12 raised to 3. So that gives you we are actually by year 3 we are getting more than our investment. So here again, if the payback period is 3 years, we will take up this investment. Okay, so that's what we have here when we compare the discounted payback with the payback. So what we find here is that in general, when you look at the discounted payback, it takes more time to recover our investment. And the reason why it takes more time is because we are using the present value of each cash flow. And typically, the present value of each cash flow is smaller than the cash flow itself. So if you look and try to answer these questions, does the discounted payback rule account for the time value of money? It does. Does the discounted payback account for the risk of the cash flows? It does if we are using the appropriate interest rate. Does the discounted payback provide an indication about the increase in value? It does not. Should we consider the discounted payback rule our primary decision rule? Mainly because it does not address all the questions we talked about, we should not be using that as the primary indicator. So it includes a time value of money, easy to understand, does not accept negative estimated investments, and bias towards liquidity. Okay? And what are the disadvantages? May reject positive NPV investments, requires an arbitrary cutoff point, ignores cash flows beyond the cutoff point. So now we want to talk about the net present value. So what do we do in the case of the net present value? Essentially what we are saying is the NPV is the present value of the cash flows received minus the present value of the investment. So here that is the difference between the market value of a project and the cost. So how do we do that? The first step is to estimate the expected future cash flows. The second step is to estimate the required return for the projects of this risk level. And the third step is to find the present value of the cash flows and subtract the initial investment. So when you talk about the NPV, essentially what we are doing is that we are finding the present value of the cash flows received net of the investment. And that's what we do here. So let's look at the questions. Does the NPV rule account for the time value of money? It does. Does the NPV rule account for the risk of the cash flows? It does. Does the NPV rule provide an indication about the increase in value? It does, because let's say we plug in the numbers and we find the NPV is 100. It basically tells you that you are increasing the value of the project by 100 if you take up this investment. Should we consider the NPV rule for our primary decision rule? That is the reason why academics always trust that the NPV is the best method. Okay. So let's look at the NPV for the project. So the NPV of the project is the present value of the cash flows received, which is the 63,120 in year 1. We want to find the present value of that. That's why we divided by 1.12. The 70,800 in year 2. Again, we divide that by 1.12 the whole square. And the 91,080 in year 3, we want to find out the present value. That's why we divide that by 1.12 the whole raised to 3 minus the investment, which is the $165,000. So that gives you an NPV of $12,627.42. Now with the financial calculator in chapter 10, you've already been using that. So we can enter the cash flows. CF0 is 165,000 negative. C01 is 63,120. C02 is 70,800. C03 is 91,080. And you can find out the NPV. So here, the NPV is positive. And what that means is that whenever you have a positive, you want to take up the project. A positive NPV means that the present value of the cash flows received is more than the investment. And here, that basically tells you that you're going to increase the wealth of the owner. So how do we find out the NPV? Using a spreadsheet. Let's open this up. Okay, so here, if you do the NPV, what we have to do here is take the NPV. Okay, NPV is the function in Excel, and then the first is the interest rate, and then you have the cash flows. So one thing you want to be careful about is that you want to make sure that you keep the NPV in brackets. You have the cash flows received, and you want to make sure that the cash flows that you invest, which is the 165,000, you want to make sure you have it outside the brackets. Otherwise, your the Excel would assume that is the year 1 cash flow. So that's the reason why you always want to subtract the initial investment after computing the NPV. Now we want to talk about the internal rate of return, and as I told you before, the internal rate of return is almost equally used in industry. Now why is it used so much? Although it might have some issues, the main reason why it's so popular is because it's one number that gives you a lot of information about the project. So as an example, you plug in the numbers and you find that the IRR is 15%. What that tells you is that it tells you that for every dollar you invest, you are making 15 cents. That's one example. Or it tells you that at an interest rate of 15%, you're going to break even on the project. So these are a couple of examples. So at an interest rate of 15%, the NPV is going to be 0. Okay. IRR is the return that makes the NPV equal to 0, or that is the break-even interest rate. And here, what is the decision rule? The decision rule is accept the project if the IRR is greater than the required rate of return. So how do we compute this? So all that we do here is that without a financial calculator, it is very difficult. You either have to graph it or use different interest rates and figure out when you have a 0 NPV. That's one way. Or with the financial calculator, so that's what we have here. When I started teaching, people did not have financial calculators, or Excel was also not very popular. So the only way you could do it is do something like a graph, as you see here, plot the NPV against the interest rate, and here you will find that at an interest rate of approximately 16%, the NPV is 0, and that is the internal rate of return. So if you want to look at the same questions, does the IRR rule account for the time value of money? It does not explicitly, although we have an interest rate that we get. Does the IRR rule account for the risk of the cash flows? Again, it may not explicitly, although we found out the IRR and we want to compare that with the the cost of capital. Does the IRR rule provide an indication about the increase in value? It may not in dollar terms, it does in percentage terms. Okay, should we consider the IRR rule for our primary decision rule? So these are the reasons why academics stress the importance of the NPV. But as we said before, the IRR is very popular. And why is it popular? Knowing a return is intuitively appealing. So you could be a marketing person, you could be a management person, you get one number that gives you a lot of information. It is a simple way to communicate the value of a project to someone who doesn't know all the estimation details. So that's one reason why it's popular. And if the IRR is high enough, you may not need to estimate a required return, which is often a difficult task. Okay. So if you want to summarize the decision rules, the net present value says accept it. The internal rate of return says accept the project, while the payback rule and the discounted payback said that we have to reject the project. Now, how do you find out the IRR? Using the Excel, you use the IRR function and enter the cash flows, and basically if you want, you can enter the guess number. You don't really have to, and you should be able to get the IRR as the answer. So please try to open the Excel here and try to figure out how to use that. Okay, so the IRR is IRR B2. So B2 is the investment. Okay, and then you have the range of cash flows. Okay, so that is B2 to E2. So E2 is the range of cash flows. You should be able to get the IRR. Okay. Now, how do we compare the NPV with the IRR? So NPV and IRR will generally give us the same decision. Now, we want to talk about the cases where the IRR might not give you the right answer. So the two cases where you might have difficulty is when you have non-conventional cash flows. So what is a non-conventional cash flow? A non-conventional cash flow means that the cash flows change sign more than once. So typically what we assume is that you spend some money initially and then you start making money. But in reality, you might spend money, you make money in a few years, again you might have losses, and again you might have positive cash flow. So basically here we are saying that the cash flows may change sign more than once. Okay, that's one example. The second is mutually exclusive projects. So what that means is that the initial investments are substantially different and the timing of cash flows is also different. So either we might spend 10 million for the first project and 50 million for the second. That's one example of that. And the second is where, let's say you invest the same amount today, but in one project you're getting paid earlier, the other one you get more money but in later years. So in both those cases you might get the wrong answer. So what are mutually exclusive projects? A mutually exclusive project means that you might have several investments, you have a choice, but ultimately you pick only one of them. So as an example, you want to buy a car, you look at different cars, you might look at a Toyota, you might look at a Chevy, you might look at a Ford, you might look at a Honda and so on, but ultimately you only buy one car. So that's an example of a mutually exclusive project. But sometimes you might also have independent projects. So what are independent projects? Independent projects means that you have plenty of money in hand and you can take up all the investments as long as they are good. So another example is that you might want to buy a house and a car, and the choice of the house does not affect the choice of the car. You have enough money to do both of them. Okay, so let's first look at IRR and non-conventional cash flows. So when the cash flows change sign more than once, you might get more than one IRR. So essentially here, if you go back to your school years, when you talk about the IRR, essentially what we are doing here is that you are trying to find out the solution for an equation. Okay, and in this case, when the equation has changes sign more than once, you might get more than one answer. So that's a problem with the IRR. Okay, so as an example, suppose an investment will cost $90,000 initially and generate the following cash flows. Year 1, 132, year 2, 100,000, year 3, minus 150. The required return is 15%. Should we accept or reject the project? So if you do the NPV profile and plot it, what you find here is that you can get two answers. So IRR equals 10% and IRR equals 42.66%. In both these cases, the NPV is 0. So what does it mean? It basically tells you that if the IRR is 10% and your cost of capital is 15, you will not take up the investment. On the other hand, if the number is 42.66 is correct, it basically tells you that you want to take up the investment because you are making a lot more than your cost of capital or the required rate of return. Now, chances are, if you do this in Excel or you do it in the financial calculator, you will get only one answer. The second answer is being cut off by the programming as far as the Excel or the financial calculator is concerned. So this is one of the shortcomings of the IRR. Okay. Now, what is the second problem? The second problem is when you have mutually exclusive projects, and as you said before, it basically means that you will only pick one of the projects. So here, with the NPV, choose the project with the higher NPV, and with the IRR, choose the project with the higher IRR. So let's look at this example. So here, you are investing 500 for project A. You get 325 and 325 for both the years. Okay, so the IRR is 19.43% and the NPV is $64.05 million. Okay. Now for project B, you are investing 400, you get 325 and 200. The IRR is 22.17 and the NPV is 60.74. So what that means is that project A is good if you are looking at the NPV because you're making $64 million, and project B is good if you are using the IRR method because it has a IRR, a higher IRR. So basically here what we are saying is that you are getting conflicting answers. IRR says pick project B, NPV says pick project A. And if you look at the graph, it basically shows that IRR for A is at an interest rate of less than, I think, around 12%, 11.8. You find that A is better, and at an interest rate of about 11.8, you find that B is better. So the choice will flip at 11.8. Okay? And the reason why the choice flips is because you find that if you go back, okay, you find that for project A, you are getting more money up front. Sorry, for project A, you are getting equal amounts, 325 and 325 in the first 2 years. While for project B, you are getting more money up front. You get 325 in the first year. So what we find is that at high interest rates, project B becomes more attractive. And the reason why it becomes more attractive is because you are getting more money up front, while at lower interest rates, project A might be more attractive. So NPV directly measures the increase in value, and whenever there is a conflict between NPV and another decision rule, you should always use the NPV. So IRR is unreliable in the following situations: non-conventional cash flows and in mutually exclusive cash flows. So if you want to summarize the things we talked about, the net present value is the difference between market value and cost, and it tells you that take the project with the NPV is positive. It is perhaps the best method and has no serious problems. The internal rate of return, discount rate that makes the NPV equal to 0, and take the project with the IRR is greater than the required rate of return. IRR is unreliable with non-conventional cash flows. The payback, length of time until initial investment is recovered. Take the project if it pays back within some specified time period. While the discounted payback, you want to look for the present value of the cash flows, and then you want to see how much time it takes. Okay. Okay. So I think this is pretty much the end of this chapter. I think this is an important chapter, and perhaps when you look at chapter 10, Chapter 9 is relatively easy because we are looking at the different ways to evaluate an investment, while Chapter 10 talks about finding the cash flows, and Chapter 10 is very closely related to Chapter 2. So it might be a good idea for you to, once you finish this, to go back and take a look at Chapter 2, and then we talk about Chapter 10 very soon. Okay? Take care.